me to come for a series if he would do it during better weather. And we were trying to decide if the weather was a product of Satan trying to keep us from having people to come that needed to come, or if Johnny accused me of just causing the storms being the speaker, so I don't know. Hope you had a good day, and I'm kind of tired. It's been a long day, and I had one of those days where I just want to stand here and tell you, whatever you do it God's way instead of Satan's way, because when you get away from God and do things Satan's way, it sure gets messed up. And part of what I saw today just reminded me of that. In fact, I was having lunch with Mike Kessler today. Some of you know that name. Mike's long-standing elder at West 7th, great man. And as we were eating lunch, we were talking about a particular family situation, and his statement was, how could things get any worse? And if I describe the situation to you, you would agree that's about as bad as it gets. And indeed, it is a bad situation, but once again, it's just what happens when we get away from God. And when we allow Satan to take control of our lives, and when we hand him the keys, he's going to drive us in the ground. And so I don't have that in my notes. I have that in my heart tonight because of the things I see and because of the tears that have been shed today. And so just let me start that way tonight. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Everything's working well tonight. Thank you guys up there for helping me tonight. We had few enough last week that I just kind of backed off a little bit and slowed down, and I'm going to cover everything I intended to cover. However, next week I'm going to double up a little bit. Tonight we're talking about parenting in the early years, and we're not only going to be talking about parenting in the early years. As we get on into the lesson, I'm going to talk about extended family, and I'm going to kind of talk to some of you who are grandparents. And so if you don't want me talking to you, you may want to get up and leave real quick. But I hope you won't, because I think some of this will be helpful to all of us as we try to figure out how to deal with changes in life when children come along, and how we want to work to prioritize our relationship with God in those years of transitioning to parenting, and how we want to prioritize our relationship in our marriage with our spouse, because that one so oftentimes pays the price when we add children to the family. Now, I have changed the slides a little bit and have worked on them, kind of continued to edit them some tonight, but I have at the beginning of the lesson the same slides that we went over last week, and I'm going to go through those real quickly, deciding that if you weren't here last week, you at least could see what we talked about and kind of get a glimpse of it. I think that also will kind of help set up where we want to go in this lesson. And so I'm not going to read these to you. I'm just going to refer to these first few slides in review as we go through them. From Psalm 127, the first 5 verses, family is just better when you build the house around the Lord. And then from Mark 9, verse 37, we have a couple of passages here that showed from Jesus how valuable children are and how important they were to him. The same from Matthew chapter 18. I mentioned last week it's a scary thing to have somebody a doctor hand us a baby and say, that's yours, now it's your job to keep it alive. It's your job to teach it. It's your job to train it. And it's usually not said upon our children's birthdays, but the most serious implication there is it's your job to get that child to heaven. Now, if that's not a staggering thought, I don't know what is. And we began our class a couple of weeks ago, or ended our class actually a couple of weeks ago, of young marrieds at West 7th, where we have about 15 couples, and I'll talk more about them later tonight. But we ended that with me asking the question, what's the absolute scariest thing you can think of that would happen to your children? And they thought a little bit, and they knew exactly what I wanted them to say. And one of them soon spoke up and said for them not to go to heaven. And I said, yep, that's exactly right. That's it. It is a scary thought. And so it's important for us to do family the way God wants us to have. And first challenge for parents, other than having a relationship with God, is to maintain that marriage in the midst of children. We talked last week about the decline statistically in the marriage relationship when children come along. We talked about why that happens and how women, mothers often feel like so much of whom they are and what they enjoy doing is no longer existent because they don't have time, they don't have the energy because of the demands of having children. And because of that, statistically today, fewer women are having children. And let me get on down. The good news is, while indeed having children does bring challenges and does bring great joy, and especially how that having children can take away and oftentimes does take away from the marriage relationship, the good news is it doesn't have to. And as I will continue to say, and as I'll preach to you every chance I get on this topic, working to maintain that best friend relationship in the midst of centering that relationship around God truly works. We just have to be very proactive in making that work. And we talked about this process that all marriages, I think, at one level go through, of going from being on the cloud to waking up one day going, why don't we have quality time together? Why don't we enjoy each other the way we used to? Why don't we not have things in common? And we looked at two challenges last week. The first one is the financial pressure that comes when children come, and I gave some numbers here showing how much you guys cost. and worth every bit of it, by the way. Yeah, right. Almost all days. And even in Tennessee, how much it simply costs to have a baby, naturally or C-section. And this number that we talked about, Rodney, how many children do y'all have? 3? You need to ask for a raise, because each one of those, he told me to say that, by the way. Each one of those statistically costs $233,000, not including college, up through the age of 17. It's a big number, and I think that probably is an average number, not necessarily based on rural middle Tennessee scales, because we didn't spend nearly that much on our children, even though sometimes it felt like it was getting close. And I talked about suggestions for each one. Live on what you make. Be careful about that. I want my child to have more than I do. If one spouse is a spender and the other saver, work on having control. Get ahead, not behind. And I'm flying through this, but I want time for the things that I haven't talked about. And then number 2, we talked about household responsibilities and how they change, and how especially there is a significant difference for the mom that comes with the new child. And suggestions. All right, let's get to number 3. And this is where we left off. Challenge number 3. When children come along, one of the issues that always is the case is parents always have differing views on disciplining. And when I'm working with couples in the counseling room, it is just always the case that if they are having issues, and if they have children, I'm going to hear at one point or another, well, he doesn't discipline the way I do, or she doesn't discipline the way I do. Now, I want you to think about that. Does that surprise you? Does it surprise you that virtually every situation involves fathers and mothers not being exactly at the same place in terms of discipline? Well, think about it. So when you were a child growing up, did you have a parent that you played or that you went to more so than the other because they were different in how they, everybody's going, oh yeah, he's right. It always is the case. Sure, we did that, didn't we? Oh, well, I hope mom deals with this, or I hope dad deals with this, or we might even go so far as to say, if we've done something wrong, I'm going to go tell on myself to mom, because that'll be a whole lot easier than if dad finds out. or sometimes it's the reverse. And again, having said that, my question would be, in your growing up childhood years at home, if you had mom and dad at home, and I hope that you did they always act exactly the same, feel the same, discipline the same when it came to discipline? And we almost all will say, no, some of us would say close, but it is the case that no two people are going to be alike in every way, and especially when it comes to discipline. Now, let me go ahead and develop this just a little further, and then I'll advance the slides. I want you to think about how many situations play into that scenario. For example, one of the things I'll mention in a minute is one of the things that changes how we view discipline and how we practice discipline is how much time we spend with the children or with the child. That makes sense, doesn't it? Especially for stay-at-home moms, you know exactly what I'm talking about. What happens when mom has been with little Johnny all day long, and he had a little sugar at the wrong time in the morning, and he has been wired and bouncing off walls all day long. And about 5 or 6 o'clock when dad comes home, little Johnny has worn mom out, and the next time he comes running through the house, that's the last time. And so dad comes in, and little Johnny comes running through the house, and all dad can think of is, wow, do you see how fast my athlete is? You see how quick he can run. Isn't that cute? Quick, where's my phone? Let me video. Why? Well, because there's so many pieces of the discipline puzzle. And parenting styles do differ. Well, let's look at one couple's description. And just notice, this just sounded so real to me when I found it and read it. John and Sherry discovered that they differed on just about everything when it came to the baby. John is just much more laid back than I am, says Sherry. He gets on the floor and plays wherever our son happens to be, even if it means overturning the laundry basket. And he lets naps happen anywhere, anytime too. I'd come home to see Jake sleeping in the middle of a circle of toys on the living room floor at dinner time. Sherry, meanwhile, wanted us to set up PlayStations rather than have toys strewn where they belonged to get Jake in the right habit. Ditto for scheduled naps. We were resentful and snapping at each other all the time, she says. Now, you see some of the personality differences in the statement, don't you? You see a mother who is very detail-oriented, very organized. You know, her system for fixing any problem is to organize it. If you organize anything, you'll fix it. On the other hand, he's laid back. Oh, what does it matter? He'll say things like, you only have kids once. He's only going to be this age once. He's not old enough to understand. It's okay. Well, which one of them is right? Well, it depends on what part of that you're looking at. But I don't necessarily lean toward him or to her. You may be thinking, yeah, only because you're a dad, or you're a husband, or you're a father. Oh, I get that. But my point is, we're going to have differences. And when children come along, if it is our solution to fix the differences by convincing him to think like I think in every way, or to convince her to think just like I do, it's never going to happen, and there's going to be continual frustration. That makes sense, doesn't it? When you're not in the heat of the moment and not emotionally involved, makes all the sense in the world. And so it makes sense to me that what we do is figure out, how do we deal with our differences? How are we kind in what we say and how we feel? How do we deal with not having to have our way all the time? Having to deal with somebody who sees something differently is a whole lot easier when we are respectful. But let's go on. Were your parents exactly like each other when it came to discipline? We've talked about that. And it is the case that we tend to think that we should discipline our children, statistics say, similar to how we were disciplined. Now, it sometimes happens where husband was disciplined very similarly to the way wife was disciplined. However, to place them on exactly the same place on the scale or on the spectrum, That's just rare when that happens right there close. And once again, we tend to think, well, this is how discipline is done. And so we have issues that come here. And this one's big. Discipline differs somewhat based on that time thing that I was talking about. And I could expand that to say time, stress, things at work, problems at home, finances, how much sleep we've gotten. All of these things play in, and when one might tend to be more lenient because the mood is better, and one might tend to be more stringent because the mood is worse, well, that could be problematic, and we understand that. So, what do we do about all this? I've done a good job of describing the situation, I think, but so how do you fix it? What do you do? Well, here are a few suggestions. Number one, we have to start with the fact that we are respectful of each other's differences. No relationship is going to be a good relationship if any one person in that relationship thinks that he or she is always right. Now just think about that. That's kind of a blunt way of saying it, but if I have a boss at work and I get frustrated when my boss doesn't see things the way I do, I'm probably not going to have a very good relationship with my boss, because it's not going to take long before we're going to see a situation that involves a decision, and it's going to be seen differently. That obviously is also the case at home, and being respectful of others just because they don't see things exactly the way we do enables us to deal with those differences much better than if we don't do that. Number two, don't differ on discipline in front of the kids. Now, Tina's really good about and really big on letting children see that we're human and we make mistakes and we're not perfect. She does a good job of talking about that to couples that we work with, and in situations where she has the opportunity to talk about that. And she's right. Why? Well, we don't want them growing up being so hidden from our humanity that once they make a mistake, they think they have let down the bar or become something that we expected them not to become. It's important for us to let our kids know that we mess up, to tell them we're sorry. It's important for us to teach them how to deal with mistakes that we and they make. All that's very important. However, it's also the case that there are some differences that needed to be discussed in the bedroom or outside or somewhere else. And what's going to happen is, if we differ, I think he needs a spanking. In fact, I'm reminded of a situation when I was in junior high school. My sister had done something. I was running through the house in Rogersville on Highway 72, close to Elk River, and Donna, who was 3 years older than me, ducked in the bathroom and slammed the door real quick, and me trying to keep the door open so I could get her. She locked it before I could hit the door, and when I hit the door, it cracked. And that was the preacher's house that my dad lived in, that we lived in. And there I am tearing up the Lord's property. And my dad was not happy. And my mom looked at him and said, "James, if you spank him, you got to spank her too." And you know what he did? He put up the yardstick. Whew, boy, was I glad. Now, while that's a little bit of a funny story, funnier to me than you, obviously, based on how much you laughed, and I probably should not have gone there, I'm making a point, and that is, I'm 58 years old. I still remember that very vividly. I still remember that very vividly. Why? Because I saw my mom and dad disagree on what discipline should be practiced at that point. I don't think our kids don't take note of that and play us because of it. But let's look at number 3. And this one's big also. Sometimes we just need to do what works. And we've all heard people say, well, Mom used to, or Dad used to have to beat me to death, and they'd just look at my sister and she'd change just like that. Or sometimes we'd say, well, spanking didn't do a bit of good for him, but if we would ground, or if we would take away, or if we would do this or that. Consistency in discipline is indeed the hardest consistency there is to practice. And in fact, I'm not even sure you call it consistency, because doing what works is oftentimes very different. But work hard at it. It's so very important. Well, let's go to number 4 so I can get through on time. Number 4, couple time when children come along is now family time. Think about that for those of us who are parents. Oh, we used to have time to do this and that together. We used to have time to enjoy each other and to do hobbies and things that both of us enjoy doing. Well, that changes. And look at this description. When we dated and were first married, we still were able to do our own thing. He would go out with the guys, and I had my girlfriends, and we both worked a lot, but now we're glued to each other and to the baby. We also don't feel like we ever have time together. Most of us who are parents understand that. We were with the young marriage group back before Christmas, and we had a period of weeks, and in fact, we've got about 15 couples in that group, and back last year, suddenly 8 of the couples became pregnant, just almost all at the same time. And the elders came to me and asked me what I was teaching in class. Well, as of now, we've had 4 babies, and we have 4 more to go. But you know what? Things are different. For example, last year, we had the most fun Super Bowl get-together for the young marrieds after church on Sunday at our house, and boy, our house was full. This year, when we started talking about having the young marrieds to come over, you know how many of them said they could come? Two couples. Why? Well, 4 of them are at home with new babies. 4 of them are at home trying to keep from getting sick because they're about to have their babies. In fact, number 5 is due Saturday, and number 6 is due next week. And they're in the midst of these changes. But before Christmas, Carter and Allison and Haley and Will, our son and daughter, and son-in-law and daughter-in-law came, and we had a period of weeks there where we had couples to come in to talk with the young marrieds on Sunday mornings about how things change when children come along, and how they needed to work on maintaining their relationship. And Carter said something that caught my attention, because I made the statement, I said, they love our grandchildren and their children, and their lives are blessed, and they just are truly enjoying this, and I'm not sure they would change a thing. And Carter spoke up and he said, sometimes I think I kind of would like for some things to change. And then he went on to say, there are just times that I really wish I had just the time to go hunt like I used to. Or I wish we could just get up and take off and go somewhere like we used to. Well, he wasn't begrudging the fact that they had 2 children, and they are good parents, and they love them dearly. But he was making the point, we really just don't have much quality time for us anymore. And it is the case that changes. Sometimes time just for us does seem to be a thing of the past. And mothers especially are so tired when the child or children are in bed. In fact, the next slide is going to talk about suggestions, and one of those is when you finally get the kids to bed, have some quality time together. And that sounds good in theory, but in reality, so many times, moms especially have so nothing left that when they finally get those little heads on the pillows, that big head, mom's head, shouldn't have said it that way, should I? Wants to be on the pillow too. Why? Well, because it's just a very demanding role. And I'm going to say again and again and again, you have to figure it out. You have to prioritize that quality time. You have to figure out how, because if you don't do that, you go into that coexistence. So, what are my suggestions for having quality time for couples? First of all, find time to connect, even small amounts of time at the end of the day. If you're worn out, stop and pray together at least before you go to bed. Stop and ask, how was the day? Stop and share something so you maintain that connection. Number 2, parents or babies, or babysitters rather, are not going to destroy your baby. Force yourself to let somebody else watch them so you can have some time. Number 3, find someone with different children, or with children of comparable age, and swap babysitting. When Carter was born, our firstborn, I was preaching in Mobile. We were 400 miles away from either family. We didn't have the natural babysitter. And we didn't do a very good job of finding somebody to take care of him so we could have that quality time. And we know how hard it is to do that. And number 4, and we'll talk more about this later and continue to, how important it is to have that spiritual time where we are together with each other and with God. Together with each other and God. Number 5, and this is kind of a continuation, and I'm drilling a little deeper, and that is not only do young parents of young children need to have that quality time together, but alone time, especially for mom, becomes important, becomes so important. Caring for an infant is such an all-consuming task that in your free time you're lucky to make it to the grocery store by yourself. Doing something purely for yourself can feel like a luxury, but when you deny yourself or your partner free downtime, you're likely to start resenting yourself. Now, every mom in here is going, yeah, boy, I remember those early years when I just so wished I could just simply go to the bathroom without hearing someone cry or someone scream for mommy. Why? Well, because it just feels like you don't even get that time, and how important it is to have alone time. Well, suggestions, and this again is somewhat of a continuation. First of all, dads, find ways to give mom time. By doing this gives you special bonding time with those kids. And for most of us dads, we have to work hard, and many, I'll say, need to work harder at both connecting with son or daughter or both, as well as giving mom some time. And by giving mom some time makes everything better. You know the phrase, mom ain't happy? Absolutely. Well, moms, suggestion number 2, don't think you're the only one that can care for your children. Now, first child moms often have a hard time with this. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a funny story before I show you the slide I kind of showed you just a second ago. So one of the secretaries at West 7th is good to help me. In fact, I'll put my PowerPoint slides together, and she'll take them, as she says, and make them pretty. And so if you thought I was skilled in PowerPoint, then I'm sorry. So when Rachel was putting together this PowerPoint, she got down to this and she said, "You want me to illustrate that for you?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And then she showed me what she had done. Under the "don't think you're the only one that can care for your children," she said, "You want to see what happens when you leave them with dad?" Well, it's a little clearer back here than it is on the wall, but he's pretty beaten up there, and he has 2 older brothers, I expect, which explains the middle picture. And she says sometimes leaving them with dad doesn't go as planned. However, the truth of the matter is dad does a good job with those 3 boys, and he takes care of them. And if this is the worst thing that happens to him, well, we all survived much worse growing up. Kids need to learn to be kids. So don't think you don't have time. Why? Your state of mind is much, much better if you have breaks. And dads help them to do that. Number 6. What do we do about this one? We've had a new baby or we've got young children and the grandparents are on the scene and they want time with the grandchildren and they want a lot of it, suddenly there's a new dynamic into the family. And this new dynamic becomes tricky in a lot of situations, especially those where there already are sensitive areas. You know what I mean? Well, let's try to develop this. One might say my in-laws now have a new role. They are my new baby's grandparents. And that's a special role. I now know by experience. And if you don't feel like you're having enough time with your grandchildren, it becomes a sensitive area. And especially, it is easier for me to understand my mom's or my dad's desire to spend time with little Johnny. However, what if it's the in-laws? How do we feel about that? Are we as eager for them to have time? Well, it depends on a lot of factors. Depends on your relationship with your in-laws, but it does add a whole new dynamic. What about this one? My parents have a hard time allowing me to be independent. I'm an adult, a parent might say, but I'm having a hard time convincing my parent that I am an adult. Now, I want to stop and talk about that just for a minute because I've seen it now from both angles. I know how hard it is when you have been completely responsible for your son and your daughter for 22 years to suddenly flip a switch and allow them to be independent. It is our job to keep them alive, to keep them well, to teach them, to help them make decisions. And then suddenly, there is an entrance into independent adulthood where we have to turn that switch off. Now, there are ways to look at that. In the first place, we've had 22 years of programming ourselves, or maybe more, to be that person. So if you're programmed anyway for 22 years, or you have 22 years of a habit, how difficult is it to stop that habit? Any habit of 22, 24 years is difficult to stop. So it's just difficult. But let me add to that, no woman, no female has ever surgically had maternal instinct removed from their psyche when their child became 22. You know what I mean by that? And if you want to stir up a mother hen, even with an adult child oftentimes, then you do something that ruffles the feathers of her son or daughter. Now, don't think that doesn't come into play. We all know that it does. Therefore, we have a sensitive situation that is difficult, that we have to be very careful with. Number 3, as grown children, we often think, you know what, I remember vividly times that mom and dad didn't do things very well. And so why do they feel like they have a right to tell me what to do? They weren't perfect. Well, often the older we get, the more we appreciate and respect what they did. But we saw and see their mistakes and their imperfections. One day, Carter and I were going to Atlanta to see the Braves play, right before Walter was born, our first grandson. And we were having one of those good father-son conversations, and we were talking about how his life was going to change and how we looked forward to having a grandbaby and how excited he was. And we began talking about my dad, his grandfather, who turned 86 yesterday, and took him to see Vanderbilt in Kentucky last night. First time he'd ever been to a college basketball game, and that was a lot of fun. We both enjoyed it. However, we were talking about Pawpaw, and I was laughing about how Pawpaw grew up on a tobacco farm in Kentucky, and how sports to him was play instead of something very serious as it was to me. And we just had a different view of that because we came from different places. But I made the statement to Carter. I said, son, there were a lot of things that my dad did that he should have done differently. And I said, and there are a lot of things that I fixed of those things that he messed up. I fixed those things with you. But in the process, I created my own set. And you'll likely fix most of those with your son, but you'll create your own set. Why? Because as we've talked about already, this is trial and error. It's figuring it out. It's learning from our mistakes. And a lot of times we don't learn very well until we're able to look back on it. And so don't be too hard on your parents. Give them some liberty, realizing that this is indeed difficult. And if they're trying maybe even to get more involved than they ought to, give them a little bit of license or liberty. Number 4, I need my parents or in-laws to help, but when I need it and when I want it. Well, it's easy as grandparents to feel like, hey, do I have any say-so here? What about what I would like? Because they conveniently call when they need you, and if that happens too much, you start feeling taken advantage of, even though you say yes every time because you want to be around the grandkids. But see, these things start to cause feelings. And then, what about this one? If parents or grandparents are helping financially, they think they have decision-making rights. And they're thinking absolutely correctly. Why? Well, because we're not independent. Now, I'm not saying that to say mom and dad have the right to make every decision for me regarding raising little Johnny. In fact, the real point I'm making is how important it is once we become adults to be independent. And I'm not opposed to adults helping their children when they need it at a reasonable level. And what does that mean? I realize that's hard to define. But the point I want to make is, and in fact, I counseled a couple this week who were having, in fact, a big part of our discussion in that particular session was her parents are so involved in everything we do. And I'm going, well, yeah, you live in their house, free of rent. What do you expect? If you come in and say you want to paint the wall, they may say, no, we don't want it to be painted that color. Why? It's their house. And it is increasingly the case, I believe, that children, we, in some cases, wanted more and more, and parents tend to want to help their children, but oftentimes they're hurting more than they are helping. So let's look at suggestions. For parents who have young children, I want to encourage you to set up boundaries and to kindly say things like, today's not a good day. Oh, I'm sorry, but today's not a good day. What do you do if mother-in-law calls and says, hey, I want to come over today. I ain't seen Johnny all week. Is it all right if I come over today? Well, if I say no, she's going to be mad at me. And so she comes over, and I resent that she came, that she feels like she can barge in anytime she wants to. Whereas it would have been much better had I learned or mom learned to say, today's just not a good day. I'm sorry, we'll try to do it later. But if you're a grandparent and your child or in-law says, that's not a good time, don't make it hard for them to do that. Reinforce that. Number 2, don't expect your spouse to deal with your parents. You are their child, not your spouse. Now that's difficult, and here's, in some situations especially, and here's why. Oftentimes, a child telling his mom or dad no is very, very difficult. It goes back to that situation that I talked about a while ago, except on the other end of the spectrum. If I'm a parent, it's hard for me to flip the switch when my child becomes an adult and I no longer think I need to be telling them how they make their decisions, what they need to do. In the same way or a similar way, children have a hard time bringing themselves up in how they feel to an equal plane with their mom and dad and being able to make decisions and convey those decisions, because what if I make her mad? I've never done that. I've never told my mom no. I've never told my dad no. And I hear this term over and over and over again when these kinds of situations come up. I feel caught in the middle. Because spouse is right, but mom and dad won't understand, and I can't make mom and dad upset. So, it is the case that if you're old enough to have your own child and to make decisions for that child, then you're old enough to have a right to kindly tell your mom and dad how you feel. And sometimes you need to say, I hope you understand. We're trying to make decisions the best way we can. May not make sense to you, but we're truly trying to do the best we can. And if you disagree, I'm sorry, but that's our decision. Now, that is so easy for me to stand here in front of 100 and how many other people tonight, but in the heat of the moment, when somebody is putting the pressure, that's hard to do. I understand. Number 3, I want to encourage young parents to be considerate. Be considerate of your parents' time with their grandchildren. That's easy for me to say because, how meaningful it is and how I enjoy that time with our 3. And we want our children to be considerate and mindful of allowing us to enjoy our grandchildren. It's really important. And in fact, them making an effort to do that is something we notice big time, and it makes us feel closer to them. Now, let's talk about the grandparents just for a minute before I close. First of all, allow your children to be independent. Allow your children to be independent. Tina has gotten on to me a few times because I use a phrase quite often. I try not to use it as much now, but she would catch me saying to Carter or to Haley, well, if I were you, I would. And she's saying, you're not them. You don't need to be telling them what to do. And she would follow up by saying, if they ask for your opinion, then tell them. If they don't, they're grown adults. It's not your place to give it to them. But I'm telling you, when they turned 22, I had a hard time flipping that switch. I still have a hard time leaving that switch flipped. And something as easy as, if I were you, I would do this, makes son or daughter feel like mom and dad's still trying to tell me what to do. And if I say that over and over again, they start resenting it. So be careful about that. Number 2, allow your children to make mistakes. And in fact, in the first place, if they disagree with us and we think every time they disagree with us they're making a mistake, sounds like a pride problem on my part to begin with. Oh, how many mistakes did we make with our children, thinking we were doing the right thing by, after they were born, keeping them away from germs for 2.5 years? Or not doing this, or feeding that. And, all that stuff changes so often. Who's right anyway? Do they sleep on their back or do they sleep on their stomach? Do you have a pad around the crib or do you not? It's going to change. And while we may tend to think, well, we had it all figured out, you're living proof. And in fact, one time, Allison was threatening me as much as a daughter-in-law can respectfully threat her father-in-law to get the flu shot when Walter was born, with things like, you want to be able to hold him, don't you? And I looked at her and I said, you're married to Carter. Haley lives in Nashville, doing pretty well, pretty healthy. I didn't have a flu shot when they were born. Well, we were in jest, having fun, kind of. She won. I did get the flu shot, by the way. The only flu shot I take it back. I've had 2. The next year I had to get one for Haley because I did for her sister-in-law. And if I was going to do it for her, you know how that works. But That's their job. Now it's not mine. And if I see them making mistakes to me, I need to be careful and back off. Number 3, give advice when asked for it. Be careful about doing so in any other time. And this is one of those times where, to a lot of us, I feel like I'm meddling now instead of preaching, right? But it's important. It's so very important. We need to understand our place. And for grandparents, number 4, never make your grandchild's parent out to be the bad guy, even when they're wrong. You mean your dad made you? Or I can't believe he spanked you? Or he took away your what? Now what are we doing? We're playing a little game there where we are taking advantage of our child or daughter-in-law, son-in-law to try to get them to love us more. Now, do we really want to do that? Do we really mean to do that? And again, understanding our place is so very important. Well, these are examples really in real life, but they are all biblically based. They are based on principles such as doing for others as you would have to do for yourself, the golden rule. They are principles such as submitting one to another, Ephesians 5. They are principles that come from putting God first and honoring father and mother and son and daughter and bringing them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And while we haven't spent a lot of time looking at the text, it's there, and these principles are very biblical, I'm convinced. We just need to be reminded of them so that we can do a better job of bringing our children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. If you're not yet a child of God, the decision you need to make is to put on Christ in baptism. If you've fallen away, need to ask for the prayers of the church, we encourage you to come at this time while to go stand and sing.